I learned early in our marriage that survival doesn't come with applause. My husband and I were both forced to leave school before we ever saw a diploma, not because we were careless, but because life demanded more than classrooms ever could. Bills arrived faster than dreams. Parents got sick, jobs appeared and vanished. We built our family on overtime shifts, burned meals, borrowed rides, and the kind of stubborn hope that doesn't look impressive on paper, but keeps a roof overhead. Our son grew up watching us choose work over comfort every single day. And when he earned his way into college, we thought the story had finally turned in our favor. Everything changed after he married a woman whose achievements were framed on walls we could never imagine. Her degree came from a name-brand university, one people whispered with reverence. At first, we were proud, grateful that our son had found someone driven and accomplished, but admiration slowly twisted into something colder. Dinners became silent competitions. She corrected the way we pronounced words. She laughed too loudly when we talked about factory life, as if our struggles were old jokes she had already outgrown. We could feel the air shift whenever she entered a room, like our presence was a reminder of something she wanted erased. I tried to remind myself that education shapes people differently, that maybe she didn't mean to sound so sharp when she compared our neighborhood to something she once studied in a sociology class. But it was hard to ignore the way she would tilt her head when I told stories about raising our son on minimum wage, as if my life were a case study instead of a history written in sacrifice. My husband started growing quieter at family gatherings, shrinking back into the man he used to be when bosses talked down to him. The worst part was realizing our son noticed it too, yet stayed silent, caught between the people who raised him and the woman he chose. I kept telling myself that patience would fix it, that love always finds a way to smooth sharp edges. But something in me began to harden. Years of being underestimated had taught me one thing: people who mistake silence for weakness often forget who laid the foundation beneath their feet. And for the first time in decades, I felt that old fire stirring again, the one that once dragged me through long nights and empty cupboards. This time, I wasn't planning to stay invisible. I started noticing patterns once I stopped trying to excuse everything. It wasn't just the comments anymore. It was the quiet rearranging of reality around us. Invitations to family dinners arrived late or not at all. When we did show up, seats were somehow already taken, conversations already finished, decisions already made. She spoke about networks and circles as if people like us belonged to an outdated system that would eventually be replaced. My husband pretended not to hear, but I saw how his hands tightened around his coffee mug every time. She turned our lives into a footnote. What hurt most was how easily she slipped into the role of authority. When our son talked about his job, she corrected him, polished his words, rephrased his struggles into glossy career language. It was as though she were editing him into someone unrecognizable, someone who no longer carried the weight of where he came from. I began to feel like our history was being rewritten in real time, not erased loudly, but quietly curated into something more acceptable for her world. I didn't confront her. Instead, I listened. I listened when she bragged about her classmates now working in elite firms, how she casually dismissed people who hadn't invested in themselves early enough. I listened when she suggested we downsize our holiday traditions because they were a bit dated. I listened when she talked about moving our son across the country, far from the factory towns and family homes that embarrassed her. Each word was wrapped in politeness, but underneath it ran a steady belief that she had risen above us and that we were merely background noise in the life she was designing. The turning point came during a visit that was supposed to celebrate our wedding anniversary. We arrived with a small gift we'd saved months to buy, something modest but chosen with care. She glanced at it, smiled thinly, and placed it on a shelf already crowded with awards and framed certificates. Then she began talking about an upcoming fundraiser at her alma mater, explaining how they were only inviting people who fit the brand. She never said we didn't belong. She didn't have to. The message settled between us like dust. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at a ceiling we didn't own, in a house that no longer felt like family. I replayed every sacrifice my husband and I had made, every missed class, every broken-down car, every hour spent choosing our son over ourselves. None of it had been glamorous. None of it had earned us a title or a badge, but it had built a man strong enough to thrive anywhere. And now that very foundation was being dismissed as something to grow out of. By morning, I knew I was done shrinking. I wasn't going to beg for respect or wait for someone else to notice the imbalance. I had spent a lifetime making quiet, practical decisions that kept people afloat. And this was no different. The way she spoke about brands and investments finally made sense. She believed success erased the past. But I understood something she didn't. Success without roots is fragile. As we packed our bags to leave, I looked at my husband, who was already bracing himself for another round of polite distance, and I felt an unfamiliar calm. The next time she tried to make us feel small, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I already had a plan forming, and it was built on the very history she was so eager to forget. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A family gathering was planned to celebrate our son's promotion, an event his wife had taken full control over, complete with guest lists that mirrored her professional world more than our family tree. I didn't interfere. I arrived with my husband early, not with speeches prepared, but with quiet confidence. When the room filled with polished smiles and impressive resumes, I felt no urge to compete. I simply watched, letting the moment grow heavy with its own importance. At the right time, I shared the story no one in that room knew, not as a confrontation, but as a truth finally spoken. I described how two teenagers without diplomas had worked through layoffs, illnesses, and empty refrigerators to raise a boy who never once doubted he could succeed. I spoke of factories, late nights, and the long, uncelebrated labor behind every achievement now being praised. The room shifted. People who had only seen titles and universities were suddenly faced with the reality beneath them. I didn't look at my daughter-in-law while I spoke, but I felt her attention settle like a weight. There was no anger in me, only clarity. I made it known that our son's confidence, resilience, and work ethic were not gifts from elite halls, but from a home built without privilege. That foundation wasn't something to outgrow. It was something to honor. The rest happened quietly. Compliments turned toward us. Questions replaced assumptions. My husband stood taller than I had seen in years, as if a burden he'd carried in silence had finally been lifted. My daughter-in-law remained polite, but something in her posture softened, as though she were seeing us for the first time rather than through a lens of comparison. On the drive home, there were no triumphant words between my husband and me. We didn't need them. The victory wasn't in changing her overnight or earning applause from strangers. It was in reclaiming the story of our own lives. We had not failed by leaving school. We had adapted, endured, and built something that could not be printed on a certificate. For the first time since our son's marriage, I felt at peace. Not because we were finally respected, but because we had stopped measuring ourselves against someone else's definition of worth. Our story was complete as it was, written in effort rather than ink, and no ivy-covered wall could ever diminish that again.